This is Duke University.
My name is Maytha Alhassen. I'm a Ph.D. Provost Fellow at USC in American Studies and Ethnicity. I think everybody becomes a little bit shocked when they find out that I am obsessed with Malcolm X. Not so much if you're a Muslim American, especially if you're a Muslim American who is the child of an immigrant. For whatever reason, he's inspired even many immigrant children who had strayed away from Islam to return back after reading the autobiography, or to become much more political than they had done before growing up in the US. So people become stunned when they find out that a daughter of Syrian parents was so drawn to Malcolm X. I think Malcolm X, not for just what he represented in terms of the history of Islam in America and what it meant to be a Muslim, somebody who is engaged in the fight for social justice, because that is definitely an ethic of Islam. It's an underlying principle that is found throughout the Quran. I think he is an inspiration for people even outside of Islam, because at the heart of what he was trying to do is use the issue of Black liberation to liberate us all. And so it's kind of a little difficult to explain, because we operate in such a framework of understanding how racism operates. We don't understand that the way that white supremacy is constructed is on the foundation of anti-Blackness. And Malcolm X understood that. Malcolm X understood that we will all suffer, even white people will suffer the disease of supremacy, because it's a disease to want to dominate people, right? And he called it the cancer of racism, right? It's a cancer, it will eat at your body. We will all suffer from it. We will all die from it unless we start with the liberation of Black people, which is how the dominance of whiteness was built on. I think right now what's happening in terms of like Ferguson, Black Lives Matter, is that they're adopting an international lens with local activism. Locally based activism, I should say. I just came back from a trip that I co-organized with one of the founders of the Dream Defenders, which is a civil rights organization that came out of Florida in response to Trayvon Martin's murder, and to mobilize against stand your ground laws, to repeal stand your ground laws. So with him, he had this vision. Ahmed Abu Zunayd, who is one of the co-founders, he's Palestinian, he's involved in Black liberation movement. He wanted to take his Dream Defenders to Palestine to see his homeland. And I was working on connections between Black people, Black internationalism more specifically, and the Arab diaspora from a transnational lens. And I said, oh my God, this is perfect, because I'm also looking at this through the lens of the delegate and delegations. Could I come in and just take some field notes and interview you all? And he said, sure. And I just inadvertently became one of the organizers of this trip, which has made me glow with such pride, because I'm still in awe of what we accomplished. Anyways, we started last March to think about who we'd want on a trip like this. So he definitely wanted to bring Dream Defenders. And we were actually supposed to leave on August 10th, but this was the time of the summer invasion of Gaza. And so a couple weeks before, we decided with the council of the foundation that we were working with, and with IMEU, the Institute for Middle Eastern Understanding, that this was not a good time to bring folks over. The climate was just too intense. So we decided to reschedule it. Ironically, most of the people that would have been on the trip ended up going to Ferguson and working with Ferguson activists. And we didn't know that we were going to bring Ferguson activists beforehand, because we didn't know about Ferguson. So this was stunning. So what ended up happening is we rescheduled a trip for January 2nd through 12th and reconstituted the delegation. And it turned out to be a delegation that was mostly composed of Black social justice activists, artists, and academics. Philip Agnew, Mark Lamont Hill, Patrice Cullors, who's one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter, poet Aja Monet, and a whole score of other brilliant, beautiful people. We went in January, and it was really interesting and amazing to hear their responses to what they witnessed again, and to have poetry come out of what we saw as well. But I think the thing that was so interesting was that delegation was composed of people that did what Malcolm wanted to do. Malcolm wanted to internationalize the struggle for Black liberation at the UN and take it to the level of human rights, take the civil rights movement to the level of human rights on an international stage. That's why he was traveling and meeting with heads of state and meeting with some segments of civil society and university students, because he was trying to mobilize a force of support through the dark world, quote unquote, he called it dark skin world, what was known at that time as the third world. He was trying to garner support. So some people on that trip actually, like Ahmed Abu Znaid, he argued Dream Defender's case against Stand Your Ground laws in Geneva to the UN's Commission on Torture. And so did some activists that we took from Ferguson, Hands Up United, an organization that is based in Ferguson. Rapper Tef Poe and Tara Thompson went to Geneva with the family of Mike Brown to also argue their case of immense torture that had just taken place. So these people were living Malcolm's dream, and I think that it would make sense to say that they were inspired by him, but they see him as part of a legacy of Black liberation as well. He's not just a blip, and there wasn't a movement that he didn't inspire, right? So Black Panthers called themselves Children of Malcolm. Stokely Carmichael obviously was very much influenced by Malcolm X. He almost mimicked his itinerary across North Africa and the Middle East because he was so inspired by Malcolm. There is a traditional narrative that a lot of people are familiar with when it comes to Malcolm X. It's kind of what I'd like to call Disney cartoonish version of how we think he transformed his vision on race and politics. And it's only because a lot of people just rely very heavily on Alex Haley's autobiography on Malcolm X. It's called the Autobiography of Malcolm X as related to Alex Haley, but people don't understand that Alex Haley plays a significant role in arcing the story of Malcolm's life. So the important thing for us to remember is that he's creating a story with a compelling character. So the story goes, he goes to, he was in the Nation of Islam, and supposedly the Nation of Islam is this race-focused, Black separatist, quote unquote, hate group, which I push back a lot on. I think that we need to reassess and reevaluate the way that we understand the Nation of Islam vis-a-vis Islam and vis-a-vis politics and the civil rights movement in the US. So he leaves the nation and then he goes to Mecca, and now apparently he's seen that there are Muslims from all colors, and now he can't be a racist anymore because he's bonded with all of the Muslim world in Mecca at the Hajj. So the story doesn't really go like that. The story goes that he starts to see, yes, how widespread the Muslim world is, but he had been to the Middle East while he was in the Nation of Islam in 1959, and we don't talk about that story as much as we do the post-nation one, because it's not a convenient narrative, right? So if he went in 59 and he went to Saudi Arabia because he was setting up an Umrah trip, a trip that is outside of the time of the Hajj, he was setting it up for Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam. He was going to almost all the same spots in Saudi Arabia that he went to in 1964 for his Hajj. He didn't do Umrah, but he was well aware of the people and places of the land 5 years beforehand. And he even mentions in his diaries meeting the same people he met 5 years ago. So if this is a new revelation, why didn't he feel that same way back in 1959? And I think the story is that he actually, in his diaries, points to the hospitality of people as being a great inspiration for him to kind of transform his take on what Islam is really about. And for him, it's not that Islam transcends race, it's that Islam creates what he calls a spirit of brotherhood. And for him, the active practice of a spirit of brotherhood is how we solve the cancer of racism. It's not that Islam, just by inducting yourself into Islam and practicing Islam, are you automatically not racist anymore? It's being involved in the practice of brotherhood and oneness. I think what was really interesting to me in my research was finding out that travels matter and actually the arts matter a lot. And that's something that we didn't consider when we wanted to or thought to explore, interrogate Malcolm X's development of his political and spiritual philosophical groundings. So what I realized, because he took a trip to Gaza on September 5th through September 6th, what I realized was that the fact that he was there and witnessing just contributed to a whole different development around his imagination of the Palestinian plight. But what took it to another level was that the evening of September 5th, he spent it listening to Harun Hashem Rashid, who was a Gazan poet, relate to Malcolm the story of his flight from Gaza during the Khan Yunis massacre in 1956. And he recited poetry to Malcolm, and Malcolm even writes this down in his diary to the side. You could see that it had an impact on him really strongly. And a couple of days later, he meets the PLO chairman at a hotel in Cairo, and then a couple days later, he writes an op-ed in the Egyptian Gazette, which is an English language daily newspaper based in Cairo. He writes an op-ed called Zionist Logic, where he lays out his case for Palestinian liberation and his anti-Zionist politics that he defines as 20th century dollarism. So basically, neocolonialism. So I think when we think about Malcolm, we sometimes think him in very dry political terms, and sometimes we'll draw from the religious traditions to say this is where he got his motivation, but frequently we divorce him from the real human experience of what the arts do and what optics and witnessing does to transform the human.